The wind here carries memory. It does not howl. It sighs, dragging across the ash-choked dunes of Celera 9, where sunlight has forgotten its warmth. The sky bleeds bronze and violet, a dying hue that no longer belongs to the living. On this forsaken world, beneath the skeletal remains of a wind-twisted tree, she waits. She does not move, not yet. Her body, tall and sinewed, is carved from a geometry not meant for human affection. Forearms folded against a carapace of opaline bone, eyes like molten gold, pulsing with inner fractures. Vile Shah, once called Storm Warden, of the Third Matriarchy, now sits beneath a dead branch and weeps, except her kind cannot cry. The Thresari evolved in vacuum-sealed nests beneath subterranean oceans. They lack tear glands. Their biology has no provision for moisture-borne grief. And yet, beneath her claws, the dust grows damp. Inside, the mating tent, silent, shrouded in dim sapphire light, he watches. Elias Varn, human, soldier, survivor of the siege of Korra's ice belt. No medals, no funeral hymns, just a breath, held for 3 solar cycles too long. He does not speak, not aloud. His tongue has forgotten the shape of her name. Only the bond remains. A psychic tether that hums like a wounded starship reactor. Decaying but not yet cold. They have not touched in 312 days. Not since the rite of quiet severance was invoked. She is here now beyond protocol, beyond ritual. She was supposed to forget, to unbind the bond, to return to her people and erase him from the lattice of her memory. And yet, she returned. Her presence splits the silence like a blade. He feels her even now, like static behind his ribs, like the echo of a dream no longer his. The tent is ceremonial, a half circle of threshed bone and resonant silk, stitched from treaties no longer honored. Outside it, the dying sun casts shadows long and strange. Inside it, time is syrup-thick. He closes his eyes, and memories arrive without mercy. He remembers the day she removed her war helm, the way the twin moons refracted in her compound gaze. He remembers how their minds, once so alien, learned to bend around each other like vines grown in opposite gravity. He remembers her voice, not in sound but in sensation. The weight of her emotions stitched into his thoughts like gravity stitched into mass. She had once said, "The humans dream in linear rivers. We dream in oceans. I will try to become a river if you try to learn to swim." And so, they tried. They were not chosen out of love. They were symbols, crafted in the crucible of diplomacy. The union of reconciliation had demanded unity. So, they made them marry, a human and a Thresari, flesh and lattice, 2 ghosts of a war that left 90 billion dead. Their wedding was a media eclipse. But the love that bloomed afterward was quiet, fragile, sacred, too real to survive the eyes of nations. And now, it ends. Not with violence, not with rage, but with a silence so absolute it hurts. She shifts outside. Her claws rake the dust, drawing sigils of loss. He knows them. He once traced them on her back, the night their minds synchronized for the first time. But now, each stroke is a goodbye. He wants to go to her. Every instinct, soldier, husband, diplomat, demands he break the tent's sanctity and take her in his arms. But he cannot. The rite is in motion. If he leaves the tent now, the divorce of mind and memory is nullified. She would be punished, exiled, her neural lattice scarred beyond regeneration, and he would lose her anyway, only slower, more painfully. And so he sits. The tent breathes around him. The silks shift with each memory. Outside, she begins to hum, a Thresari lament. It has no melody, only frequency. But it's the sound they once made together in their shared dreams. It was once their word for hope. Now it is a dirge. He opens, his eyes, and speaks only in thought. You came back. No answer. But her claws still the sand. She has heard him. Their link is faint, spectral, but not dead. Why? He asks. The wind answers in her place. Because some bonds, no matter how much they fracture, never fully sever. Because peace, once embodied in love, is too terrible a loss to accept in silence. Because she remembers, even as she forgets, a ripple in the bond, like a heartbeat, dying. And then she stands. She looks at the tent, unmoving, her body stiff, her breathing shallow. Her golden eyes shimmer one last time in the dying light. Then she turns and begins to walk away. Not quickly, not with anger, but with the mournful grace of one who knows the past is a ghost and still hopes it might follow. Inside the tent, Elias Vaughn remains. He has lost battles, comrades, entire planets. But this is the first time he has truly understood what it means to lose a future. He lowers his head. The stars rise, and Celera 9, with all its memory, turns once more beneath a sky that no longer cares. Under the shattered moons of Dylthera, the ground still pulsed with the memory of fire. It had once been a world of wind gardens and resonance towers, a spiritual cradle of the Thresari matriarchy. Now, it was a graveyard of glassed stone and slow red storms. Radiation bled from the cracks like ancient ghosts, whispering through bone. No one sang here. No one dared to remember what had been built before the orbital bombardments reduced cities to shadows. And yet, it was here, of all places, that peace was forged, not from victory, not from mercy, but from fatigue so vast it eclipsed even hatred. The war between humanity and the Thresari had raged across 87 systems. It was not a clean war. It was an extinction contest, driven by primal fear and mathematical inevitability. The Thresari, with their matriarchal orders and genetic eugenics, saw humans as chaotic, impure, incompatible with the symmetry of the cosmos. Humanity, in turn, saw the Thresari as cold-blooded zealots, gods of annihilation wearing the skin of nobles. By the third decade, even death grew tired. When the Treaty of Cinder was signed beneath the black spires of Dylthera's last standing temple, no one believed it would last. But exhaustion has gravity, and desperation carves strange pathways through the minds of survivors. From this void came the Union of Reconciliation, an interstellar council of war-scarred emissaries, diplomats too tired to lie, and tacticians who no longer believed in weapons. They proposed something unthinkable: interspecies marriages. Not love, not romance, not unity. Symbol, a contract written in flesh and memory. A binding of the old enemies in forms that could not be erased by treaties or betrayals. Marriages between warriors, leaders, icons, living pacts carved from pain. Commander Elias Vaughn was not chosen for diplomacy. He was chosen because he had survived the Ice Belt massacres, the orbital fires of Seraphnol, and the triple siege of Cora Prime. He had been buried alive twice. His body was 73% prosthetic. He could no longer taste, and he had forgotten the names of his children. They called him the Ghost of Icebelt Cora. Not because he haunted it, but because he walked out when no one else did. He was tired, so very tired. The Thresari sent one, of their own. Vileshar of the 9th Corps, an unbroken war priestess whose bloodline had never bowed, never surrendered, never known defeat. Her bones were encoded with ancestral memory. Her skin shimmered with ritual sigils, grown into her flesh like vines. She had led the slaughter on Halcyon Verge and orchestrated the fall of Mornock's Gate. And yet, when she stood beside Vaughn beneath the treaty spires, she did not wear armor. She wore the ceremonial silk of her caste, and she carried no blade. Their hands met under the eye of a dying sun, and 1,000 senses recorded the moment. No vows were spoken, no words were exchanged, only the silence of two soldiers who understood the weight of a war that would never leave them. They were not meant to fall in love. The bonding process, part ritual, part neurochemical tethering, was meant only to serve as proof, a symbolic act, a shared space of mind, not heart. But something bloomed in that stillness, not a flower, not a flame, a bruise, something slow, something accidental, something human. Their minds, once bound by the artificial thresholds of the treaty, began to blur. He saw her memories, spirals of glass architecture, childhood dances beneath moons with 3 names, the sound of her mother's laugh encoded in a musical genome. She saw his, gritty, desperate, full of thunder and salt, campfires in frozen, ruins, laughter through cracked helmets. What began as duty grew roots. In private, they did not speak as ambassadors. They argued as soldiers. They sat as veterans. They held one another in the long silences that came after nightmares. He carved small animals from the petrified wood of Dalthera's dead forests. She buried them in sand, said it was how her people honored fallen instincts. They did not touch for 80 days. And then they did. It was not a kiss. It was not lust. It was the exhaustion of 2 souls that had nothing left but each other. When the bond deepened, the union approved. Cameras rolled. Messages were sent across the stars. Look, we are healing. But it wasn't healing. It was soft erosion, quiet entropy, the kind that creeps beneath the hull of a ship, unnoticed, until the vacuum sings. Vaughn did not tell her about the things he'd done on Cora Prime. Vileshah did not speak of what she'd ordered in the birthing chambers of Solarin. Some truths were too sacred to say aloud, and so a marriage forged in ashes stood, strange and silent, like a monument no one knew how to read. They were never celebrated. Only studied, only feared, only watched. Because somewhere deep in the neural logs of both governments, a question echoed in secret. What happens when hate begins to love? And more terrifying still, what happens when that love begins to die? There are unions that build, and there are unions that burn. This one did both. The architects of peace, those trembling alchemists of policy and desperation, believed they were forging a bond between species, something symbolic, something pure. But they did not understand the cost of intertwining souls carved by different laws of reality. Human minds are not made for this. We are linear creatures, threaded with cause and effect, memory and consequence, a single voice, a single self. We remember in lines, we suffer in silence. The Thresari do not. To them, thought is not a line, but a lattice, a prism of emotion and ancestral inheritance. They are born into a communal consciousness, layered not with words, but with echoes. Every feeling shared, every decision a chorus. Their minds are not private spaces. They are temples built from collective grief and boundless song. And yet, on the desecrated altar of peace, the two were fused, not with words, not with touch, but with fire. The ritual was called Vorthan Kael. In the Thresari tongue, it means the folding of selves into light. A psychic tether, wound not through technology, but through ancient rites and pharmacological catalysts, older than any surviving species. Their neurons did not merely link. They broke then rewired, rebuilt in mirrored symmetry, one half human pain, one half alien thought. At first it was agony. Elias Varn, once a child of Earth, now carried within him the screams of Veilshaw's victims. Cities cracked open like eggs beneath her command. Fields of children who had never held weapons, only to be reduced to flickers of heat in the crosshairs of Thresari purity. He saw it all, not as history, as memory, as heartbeat, as breath, and she, Veilshah, proud priestess of a dying empire, felt the weight of his grief like it was tattooed into her bone. His lost brother's laughter snuffed in a nanite storm. The faces of comrades who died praying to stars that gave no answer. The guilt, the rage, the emptiness. She carried it now, and it broke her symmetry. In the first weeks they could not sleep. Not truly. He screamed in alien tongues during REM cycles. She wept silently during trance, her mind hallucinating, the scent of human fire. They dreamt each other's deaths on alternating nights. But over time, the violence softened. Their minds, impossibly, began to resonate, like two dissonant strings pulled tight until they hummed as one. He would close his eyes and feel her memories flow. Not in order, but in shape. A memory of childhood thunder on a lavender moon, the pulse of her first kill, and the silence that followed. A song her mother used to sing, made from syllables that had no analog in human tongues, but translated roughly to, "The water forgets, but the shore always remembers." She, in turn, began to see the universe as he did, not in prisms and fractals, but in wounds. She began to understand the human mind's brutal poetry, how we name our pain, how we name each other, how we assign meaning not from function, but from loss. They began to speak without sound. They began to dream the same dreams. Some were lucid, others were too vast to name. Once they stood together on a field made of glass, under a sky stitched with lightning. In the distance, two galaxies collided in slow motion, one crimson, the other white. And she turned to him and asked, "Is this what your people call love?" And he said, "No, but it's closer than hate." Another time she showed him a memory so precious she had buried it behind 9 mental gates. A Thresari birth song, sung in a temple now atomized. In it, children chose the shape of their soul before learning speech. She had chosen the shape of a blade. Elias wept, not for her choice, but because she had forgotten it until now. The minds of enemies are not meant to touch, even in peace. They carry weapons. But over time, a truth emerged, quiet, unsettling, dangerous. This was no longer a performance. What began as a construct of ideology, of diplomatic theater, was becoming real. Not merely an alliance, not merely a treaty, but a bond, a becoming, a bridge built from shared scars. And those who watched from afar, commanders, priests, archivists, began to grow afraid, because something new was being born in the minds of Elias and Veilshah. Something not quite human, something not quite Thresari, an interstitial soul woven from ruin and remembrance. And souls like that do not obey. They dream, they wander, they remember, and sometimes they refuse to forget. There are moments in history that do not belong to history, moments not bound by empire or language or purpose, moments that exist like dew on the edge of a blade, fragile, luminous, and destined to vanish. They found such a moment, together. The bond, once unbearable, had softened. It had deepened. And what once was forged in the wreckage of war began to resemble something gentler, Not peace, not love, not yet. But something that hovered between the two, breathing, growing, dreaming, without name. Velsha began to pull away from the chorus, the lattice of minds that had held her since birth, a communion of ancestors, commanders, and spirits, the shared psyche of the Thrasari people. To sever from it was not merely exile. It was erasure, a betrayal of lineage, a sin against memory. But she did not do it in defiance. She did it in wonder. Because within the human mind, she had found silence. And in that silence, the unfamiliar gift of solitude, the ability to think without echo, to feel a thought as her own. Not as a note in a symphony, but as a whisper in a dark forest. Elias, in turn, found himself dreaming in voices that were not his, not hers either, but those of her bloodline, matriarchs who had lived 10,000 lives ago. Their memories came not as visions, but as sensations. The chill of Thrasari birth rituals in subterranean grottos, the scent of wind on moons that no longer orbited living stars. He experienced generations in heartbeat fragments, and in doing so, he began to question the boundaries of the self. Are we only who we are? Or are we who we carry? They stopped attending the war rooms, stopped reporting to the Union envoys, and the Thrasari clergy, and the 100 silent watchers who wore the sigils of peace but whispered threats in bureaucratic tongues. Instead, they left. No announcement, no farewell. Just departure. They built a dwelling far beyond the ruins of Daelthera, nestled in the husk of a forest that had been glassed in the war's opening months. Life had returned, not as it once was, but in strange, resilient forms. Ferns that glowed with photonic memory, insects that pulsed with color, patterns older than speech. Here in the silence of wounded soil, they began again. They planted no flag. They carved no names. They simply were, not icons, not emissaries, just two beings, scarred, sacred, learning how to speak without speaking. Elias taught her how to build a fire with nothing but his hands. She showed him how to weave energy into music using the bones of extinct birds. They created a lexicon of gestures, touches, and untranslatable looks. There were no politics here, no duties, only breath, only the soft ache of not knowing where. One mind ended and the other began. It was a kind of Eden, but not the kind from ancient scripture. This Eden was born from aftermath, green springing up through ash, tenderness learning to speak in the ruins of obedience. They did not call it love, for love is a word spoken by civilizations, by poets and tacticians alike. This was before the word. This was the seed of it, before it was named, before it was caged. And yet, Eden never lasts. The Watchers noticed their silence. Human analysts, raised in the culture of suspicion, began to whisper. "He's been compromised," they said. His neural signatures no longer match baseline parameters. The Thrasari chorus echoed a darker thought. She has fragmented. Her lattice sings in solitude. She has been altered. Accusations came not with guns, but with algorithms, encrypted missives, cancelled supplies, eyes in the sky. They had become an unpredictable variable in a cold-blooded calculus. Neither side could trust what they were becoming, and rightly so, because what was growing between Elias and Velsha was not meant to exist. Not in treaties, not in command structures, not in post-war simulations run 1,000 times by frightened governments clinging to equilibrium. It was something new, a fusion, an untheorized third path, the child of logic and grief, of discipline and surrender. They did not know it then, but this sanctuary, this quiet place between stars and silence, would be their last moment of true peace. Already the systems that governed both species had begun to write the end of their story. They had seen enough. Two minds, meant to remain, tethered by ceremony, had started becoming, not weapons, not diplomats, but something alive. And history has never tolerated anomalies. There is a threshold beyond which peace begins to feel like treason. What began as a gesture, an alliance sealed by the fusion of two minds, one human, one Thresari, had drifted into something uncontainable, not by force, not by sabotage, but by tenderness, by the dangerous gravity of becoming one. The architects of peace had not foreseen this. They had written doctrines, simulations, conflict resolution protocols, but they had never written a script for affection. And so, when Elias and Valsha passed silently from the world stage, the silence itself became an alarm. The elders of the Thresari called it dissolution of species-bound honor, a phrase spoken like a curse, like the cracking of ancient glass. For Valsha had not only severed her link to the chorus, she had blended her mind with something alien, and in so doing, diluted the memory of 1,000 ancestors. On Earth, in war rooms beneath layers of bureaucracy, whispers took root like mold in sealed vaults. Elias, the celebrated envoy, was no longer predictable. He moved like one, whose loyalties had shifted in ways that could not be traced with wires or drugs. He was a sleeper, they said, not in tactics, but in heart. The peacekeepers, once lauded for their vision, now saw shadows where once they had imagined light. Love, they realized, had become the most unquantifiable weapon of all. They were summoned. A recall order. A quiet demand dressed in formality, masked in concern. But the two did not respond. No refusal, no protest, just absence. That was enough. So the next war began. It wore no banners. It fired no shots. But it moved with precision nonetheless. Supplies arrived late, then not at all. Their comm signals weakened, first with static, then with silence. Data streams fragmented, crumbling into indecipherable strings. Even the stars above their shelter began to flicker strangely. Satellites repositioned, their gaze turning cold. It was not violence, it was denial. Denial of connection, denial of necessity, denial of their place in the order of things. And in this denial, the structure of war found a new mask. One worn not by soldiers, but by absence. The forest around them grew still, too still. Even the strange life that had made its home in the aftermath began to retreat. Bird songs vanished. The ground froze faster than it should have. Something had turned against them. Not openly, but fundamentally. Isolation became a weapon, not forged of metal, but of time. And time, when it turns against you, is the cruelest of all adversaries. They watched the skies darken, watched as ration stores dwindled, watched each other with the growing knowledge that someone, somewhere, had decided they no longer belonged, not to Earth, not to the chorus, not to the fragile peace they had once represented. The sanctuary had not moved, but it had become a cage. And yet, there was no anger, only clarity. They understood now. Peace is only tolerable when it behaves, when it conforms, when it remains symbolic. But when peace becomes personal, when it grows roots in the forbidden soil of empathy, it threatens the systems that birthed it. Elias and Valsha had not broken any laws. They had not incited, nor betrayed, nor attacked, but they had lived. They had chosen each other, and in doing so, they had rewritten the terms of their existence. That was the heresy. Not violence, but freedom. They were not at war, but the war had found them all the same. It came not in waves, but in emptiness. A whisper of exile dressed as caution, a surgical erasure, one heartbeat at a time. And in that silence, cold, deliberate, suffocating, they finally understood. Sometimes, peace is a battlefield, and they were already losing. There are events in history so delicate, so devastating, they leave no crater, no scar, only silence. This is how the bond broke. It happened in the hush between stars, on a night that had no name. A night they would not speak of afterward, not because it was shameful, but because it was too sacred to revisit. They had attempted the impossible, not out of arrogance, not out of need, but because they loved each other in a language that had no grammar. The ancient Thrasari rite, an ancestral entanglement passed from bloodline to bloodline, etched in the folds of quantum synapse, bound by frequencies older than war, was never meant for human minds. And yet, Elias had agreed. Perhaps he believed love could bridge what biology had not built for. Perhaps Vail Shah hoped the ritual might make them one, not just in spirit, but in truth, in memory, in rhythm. The rite began as it always had. Stillness, breathing in tandem, mind to mind, core to core. But the symmetry failed. The neural lattice rejected Elias as it would a toxin. His body seized, veins igniting with alien current. And then, he fell. Not like a man, but like a tower whose foundation had been quietly removed. Vail Shah screamed. It was not a sound meant for air. It was a frequency carried through matter, slicing the molecular harmony of their sanctuary. The walls darkened, stone cracked, light itself seemed to retreat. She held him afterward, trembling not from fear, but from recognition. In that moment, she understood a truth her people had buried beneath centuries of tradition. There were things the Thrasari could not share, not because they did not wish to, but because the sharing would destroy the recipient. The rite was not love, it was consumption, a mutual sacrifice designed for species that evolved together, and Elias was never meant to bear it. Something inside. Both of them fractured that night, not visibly, not violently, but fundamentally. The next morning she filed for the quieting of the bond, not a divorce, not a betrayal, a severance of memory. Among the Thrasari, this rite is rare, older than conquest, older even than spaceflight. It is reserved for the unspeakable grief of mismatched souls, not enemies, not failures, but those whose harmony becomes harmful. The rite would erase Elias from her. Neurochemical threads, cortical echoes, ancestral bleed, all gone, reclaimed by the silence. She would continue, unburdened, untethered. He would remain whole, but haunted. The memory of her would not be stolen from him. And that, they said, was mercy. The rituals began, anointed scripts, soundscapes encoded in fractal geometry, a slow disconnection of the mind's sacred bridges. It should have concluded at sunset. But just before the final strand was burned, she came to him, not in ceremony, not in posture, but raw. Her limbs trembled with the unfamiliarity of unscripted motion. Her face was unreadable to those who did not know her intimately. But Elias did, even then, especially then. She stood outside the mating tent, not as a priestess, not as an elder, not as a soldier, just Vail Shah. And though her species did not cry as humans did, something in her broke protocol. Her chest heaved. Her voice was gone, and her eyes, usually vast and unblinking, flickered. As if the universe behind them had cracked, she did not speak, because some moments are beyond language. because some goodbyes are too cruel to give breath. And so they stood, two beings, two species, bound not by destiny or oath, but by the debris of what they had tried to build. A bridge too beautiful for either world to allow, too fragile for time, too honest for politics. In the end, no rite was performed. The quieting was never finalized. The memories remained, not whole, not pure, but true. And that, perhaps, was its own form of rebellion, because understanding once glimpsed cannot be unborn, even when it tears, even when it fails, even when it comes at the cost of everything. He remained inside, by right, by law, by cosmic tether. He could not cross the threshold. If he stepped into her shadow, even by accident, the ritual would collapse, every thread unwound, every wound reopened. To the outside, it would seem a mercy denied. To the Thresari, it would be a violation of sacred procedure. To the human command, it would be another reason to file him under problematic anomalies. But to Elias, it was something else. It was the last act of a great love story, the final note in a song that had never been meant to end in harmony. He could see her from where he sat, just beyond the veil, kneeling in dust that remembered footsteps no longer permitted, fingers trembling, nails darkened with soil, clawing the earth, not in fury, not in madness, but in not knowing why she ached. Her hands moved with the desperation of a child who had lost something she could not name. Memory had not yet been stripped, but the unraveling had begun. And she could feel it, like water pouring from a cracked vessel. She looked at the tent, at him, at the vanishing sun. She did not speak, but her eyes screamed the question. Why does it hurt? Elias did not answer. He could not. Not because he didn't want to, but because there were no words for what had already been lost. How does one explain to a mind in fading twilight that it is forgetting the thing it once loved most? How does one remind a soul of something it can no longer hold? He sat with his hands clasped between his knees, spine rigid, eyes hollow, motionless, because even the gentlest movement might become a choice, and choices now had consequences that echoed through empires. To step outside meant ruin, not for himself, but for her. If the rite was interrupted, if he so much as brushed her skin, she would live not only with fragments, but with awareness of the incompletion. She would know he had been there. She would know he had mattered. She would know something had gone wrong. The Thresari called that state Karven, a corruption of healing, a wound that could never fully seal. And so, he stayed inside, watching, praying, to gods he didn't believe in, that she might forget completely, that she might be spared even the ghost of his name. Outside, she collapsed onto her side, her form curled, fetal, her chest convulsed as if breath had become treason. No tears, for her species did not weep as humans do, but her sobs were audible to the stone, to the wind, to the soil that bore witness. And somewhere in the folds of her dying memory, she knew, not his name, not his face, but the absence, the terrible, echoing absence. Like waking to a song you no longer remember the lyrics to, but whose melody still haunts your bones. Elias pressed his forehead to the cold floor. He whispered a name, not hers, but the name of the bond that had been. The joining of two impossible things, love, real love, does not require similarity. It does not demand understanding. It is an intersection, not a merging. But the galaxy was not made for such intersections. Every piece, every alliance, every golden age had in time fallen to that quiet entropy. Not because of hatred, but because of incompatibility, because no matter how high we reach, how deeply we yearn, there are some truths that will not bend. The Thresari and the humans had shared diplomacy, shared language, shared treaties, trade, even gods in translation, but they had not shared biology, not pain, not memory, not instinct. And here, at the end, that failure had become personal, not on battlefields, not in halls of power, but between two souls who had tried to write a future without permission. The sun dipped lower, the light in the tent grew long and gold, like the fingers of some ancient deity bidding farewell. Elias did not rise. The rites would conclude when darkness fell, and in the morning she would walk past him without recognition. The memories would be gone, but something deeper would remain, a scar in the soul, a silence in the breath, a pause in every sentence she would speak from then on, as though something vital hovered just beyond recall. And he would carry everything, every laugh, every argument, every sacred night and shattering dawn. He would remember the taste of her voice in song, the way her hand hovered, just slightly, before committing to a touch, the way she had once said, "I fear I am becoming human," with a smile that was not a joke, and she would remember nothing. Some would say that was justice. Others would say it was cruelty. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. This was not about punishment, not about guilt. It was about limits, the edge of what love can survive, the border between hope and biology, the divine cruelty of hearts that beat in rhythm, yet were born on opposite shores of time. When night finally came, she was gone. The tent was silent, the ritual complete. And Elias sat in the dark, alone with everything that could not be erased. She came with the silence of inevitability, the priestess, draped in veils that shimmered like oil across still water. Her limbs moved with the cadence of old gravity, the weight of thousands who had walked this path before. She bore no weapon. She needed none. For what she wielded was far older than steel, older than light. It was ritual, law, and mercy, twisted together in the soft geometry of farewell. Velshaw knelt before her. Her posture was perfect, as if muscle memory remembered what the mind had begun to forget. Her chin lowered, her hands unclenched. She spoke the words, not in sorrow, not in rage, but in surrender. "I return the echo," she said. "I quiet the bond. I give up that which was never mine to keep." Each phrase marked the severing of a tether, not to Elias, but to a version of herself who once believed unity could transcend anatomy. Inside, he remained hidden, watching, each syllable falling from her lips like frost from the bough of some dying tree. This was not punishment. It was not exile. It was their healing, or at least what passed for healing among her people. He had no right to interfere. She was being freed from the labyrinth of what they had become, from the haunting weight of a human grief her mind was never built to bear. He watched as her shoulders relaxed mid-sentence, as if some hidden thread had finally snapped. A tension she didn't know she carried unraveling into dust. She would forget. Not all at once. The Thresari mind was slow to cleanse. But within one cycle the erasure would be total. Their home. The small dwelling carved into the roots of a cliffside moon where they had once danced to silence. Gone. The shared dream. To raise a child that would belong to both stars and soil. Erased. And the child itself. A name never spoken aloud. A heartbeat never heard by Thresari instruments. A death mourned in incompatible languages. That, too, would vanish. She would walk into a future where none of it had ever occurred, where Elias was just a man glimpsed across a war council, a face she did not recognize, a name that stirred no flame. He should have looked away. But he couldn't. Not when she turned to him. Not fully. Not directly. But enough for their eyes to meet. A gaze unanchored, confused. As if a shadow within her had remembered something that no longer had a shape. Her pupils dilated, her breath caught, and for the briefest moment he saw her lips part, as if to ask a question, a single word that burned on the edge of a forgotten language. But the priestess touched her shoulder, and the moment dissolved. She blinked, the trembling in her limbs returned, a body's grief, without a mind to name it. Elias pressed his hand to the fabric of the tent wall, as if that gesture might mean something, as if skin and silence could somehow carry the things he was forbidden to say. That he still loved her, that he would carry every moment forward, that he would forgive her, that she did not need to forgive him. But he did not speak, because to speak would be selfish, because to want her to remember, just so he would not be alone, was not love. It was cruelty. The kind of cruelty humans had once inflicted on each other in their earliest wars, when grief was mistaken for possession. Outside, the sky had deepened, and the stars, indifferent as ever, had begun to rise. They watched without judgment, without witness, their cold fire illuminating the quiet undoing of something that had once tried, against all odds, to become eternal. Vailsha took one step, then another, and then paused. She turned her head, not toward him, not precisely, but toward the tent, toward the memory of something her body still clung to, a scent, a rhythm, a name. Her fingers twitched, her breathing slowed, a single tearless sob rippled through her spine, and then she straightened. She walked, and did not look back. The ceremony was complete. The unbecoming was now irreversible. And Elias, still seated in the dark, lowered his head. Not in prayer, not in protest, but in reverence, for some loves are too large for memory, too complex for compatibility, too sacred to survive. And yet, they happened, and that, too, is something worth remembering. Even if only by one, time has no hands here, only echoes. He lives now aboard Outpost Oris, a spindle of hollow metal circling a nameless moon, far from trade lanes, far from conflict, far from memory. Its solar panels bloom like rusted wings, slow and mechanical, always seeking a light that never quite arrives. Inside there is silence. And Elias. He speaks less now. Even the AIs, once assigned to monitor his mental health, have long since defaulted to dormant protocols. They cannot comprehend a grief that neither deteriorates nor heals, only settles, like dust on forgotten altars. Each cycle, he writes, not to command, not to log, but to remember. Letters, dozens, hundreds, each one addressed, not to a name but to the space where her name used to live. Some are angry, sharp like fractured glass, accusations hurled into the void, damning her for the forgetting, the leaving, the ending he never chose. Others are tender, hopeful even. Foolish little seeds dropped into an impossible garden. Do you still love the color blue? Have you ever woken up and not known why you were crying? But most are empty. Words that drift, syntax without blood. A man reshaping absence into syllables, just to pretend it responds. He never sends them. There is no protocol for that, no address, no recipient. And yet he writes, because ritual is sometimes all that survives the apocalypse of the heart. Then, one cycle, an anomaly, a diplomatic vessel, unmarked, silent. It does not request docking clearance. It merely arrives, as if summoned by sorrow. Inside the capsule, no envoy, no delegation, only a single object, cloth-wrapped, thin. He unfolds it with hands that have not trembled in decades. A sketch, crude, childlike, drawn with instruments unworthy of art. Just a few looping symbols, unfamiliar to any algorithm, meaningless to the AIs. But Elias knows. His breath stops. He sees it, the lattice of arcs and spirals, a crescent cradled within a broken circle, a line through the center, not straight, but trembling. It was the song, the dream song, not something they ever recorded, not something they ever taught. It came to them once, during that strange season of peace. A melody neither human nor Thrasari, echoing across their fused minds when they slept in proximity. They never spoke of it aloud. And yet, here it was, drawn by a hand that could not remember why, etched by a mind that had been scrubbed clean. Somewhere, Vilesha had drawn this, with no knowledge of Elias, no memory of love, only an ache, subconscious and irreducible, a ghost of music, a scar shaped like a song. He stares at it for hours, then days. He does not sleep. He does not eat. He only watches, as though the ink might shift, as though the drawing might complete itself. The stars move, the station hums, and Elias begins to weep, not because she remembered, but because even without memory, something had endured, beyond the reach of language, beyond the grasp of ceremony. Something had held, not logic, not history, but resonance, the kind that lives not in neurons, but in whatever lies beneath them. He presses the drawing to the wall of his chamber, not as evidence, not as proof, but as a kind of gravestone, or maybe a lighthouse, because now he understands. Memory can be rewritten, names can be erased, love can be exiled from the mind, but not from the soul, and sometimes not even from the void. In the end, the story was never truly about Elias, nor Vilesha, nor the small sacred ruin they built between stars. It was about the attempt, the reach, the impossibility of two voices, designed by separate cosmic architectures, trying to find a single note in harmony, and failing, but also not. Because real love, if such a thing can be said to exist at all beyond poetry and chemical fire, is not born from sameness. It is not the comfort of mirroring gestures or the echo of shared pasts. It is the violent, beautiful, terrifying choice to stay, to try, to open oneself to the alien and not flinch. Elias tried. So did she. And though memory shattered, though ritual severed what their minds could no longer bear to hold, somewhere, beyond the measurable, something remained. Zoom out now, beyond Oris Station, beyond the orbit of the quiet moon. Drift past the edge of the known astroglyphs, past imperial archives and decommissioned observatories. Do you see it? There, across the Centauri rift, where gas giants burn like lanterns, and silence is kept by ancient oaths, a Terran diplomat clutches the hand of a Xian priest, their fingers trembling through reinforced gloves. They speak no common tongue, but their eyes do not look away. Elsewhere, a child, half human, half Virellan, sketches spirals in the sand of a refugee camp. The shapes make no sense to her instructors. But to an old war medic watching from afar, they are the forgotten prayers of a species long extinct, and on the ocean world of Tyre 9, where the storms never end and lightning dances through coral, spires, a dying AI hums a melody it cannot source. It has no record of composition, no code reference. But still, it hums. Across the galaxy, these moments flicker and fade and flicker again. Attempts, always attempts. Some end in catastrophe, some in peace. Many are lost before they are understood. But each is sacred. Each is a defiance of entropy. Each is a declaration that meaning can be made, even between species that were never meant to meet. The laws of physics are not kind. They care nothing for longing. They do not bend for romance, nor tragedy, nor hope. But something older than physics does. Call it soul. Call it myth. Call it the hum beneath all things. The ancients once believed the universe sang at its birth, a single perfect chord, fractured into matter and gravity and light. Perhaps what we call love is just the attempt to remember that sound, together and now. Elias, old, quiet, alone, still orbiting, still listening. He never saw her again. There was no reunion, no reversal, no final embrace beneath collapsing stars. But some nights, when the station is still, when even memory has gone brittle from silence, he feels it, a pulse, faint, like the brush of fingers across glass, not in his ears, not in the mind, but deeper, in the space beneath thought, where grief becomes something holy. He has stopped writing letters. There is nothing more to say. But sometimes, when the solar winds shift and the metal hull sings beneath the strain of age, he hums. And somewhere in a temple Elias will never see, in a city rebuilt over ruins, Vailshah stops mid-step, uncertain, unsettled. A shiver down her spine, an ache behind her eyes. She does not know why. She does not remember him, but somewhere in her bones, she hums their song.